Commander Eris Thorne stood in the center of the Global Defense Command bunker, his hands gripping the edge of the central holodable so tightly his knuckles turned white. Above him, through 300 feet of reinforced concrete and lead, the surface of the Earth was being erased. The sensors painted a grim picture in glowing red and orange. The Kalan Ascendancy was not just bombing the planet. They were unmaking it. Shields in Sector 4 have collapsed, reported Lieutenant Sarah Jenkins. Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled over the console. The crust is melting. Magma is breaching the mantle. Sir, the thermal output is off the charts. The oceans are boiling. Eris did not look away from the holographic projection of the Earth. The beautiful blue and green marble was now an angry, swirling mass of black and red. The Kalan ships hung in high orbit, elegant and untouchable. They were shaped like teardrops of polished silver, firing lances of pure, concentrated plasma that struck the surface with the force of small suns. Reroute all remaining power to the deep crust blast doors, Eris said. His voice was calm, a stark contrast to the chaos on the screens. Seal the lower levels. Nobody goes down until the primary doors are locked. Sir, the evacuation elevators are still running, Jenkins said. There are thousands of civilians in the transit hubs. If we keep the doors open to let them through, the thermal shock will crack the bunker's foundation and kill everyone, Eris replied. The words tasted like ash in his mouth. Seal the doors, Lieutenant. That is a direct order. Jenkins swallowed hard, her eyes shining with unshed tears, but she typed the command. Deep within the Earth, massive gears groaned. The sound vibrated through the floor, a deep, bone-rattling thud that signaled the end of the world above. On the main screen, a Kalan dreadnought drifted closer to the planet. It was a beautiful ship, a masterpiece of alien engineering. It fired a final, sweeping beam across the North American continent. The land simply vanished, replaced by a glowing lake of molten rock. Then, the screens went black. The sensors were destroyed. The surface was gone. Eris let go of the holodable. He looked around the command center. The remaining staff stared back at him in stunned silence. The hum of the air recyclers was the only sound. They were alive, buried deep in the dark, but the world they knew was dead. Get to work, Eris said, breaking the silence. We have a lot of digging to do. 40 years is a long time to live in a box. The deep crust bunker, originally designed to house 10,000 people for 5 years, now held 50,000 and had been expanding for 4 decades. They had hollowed out massive caverns in the bedrock, building a subterranean city lit by harsh, artificial sunlight. Hydroponic farms stretched for miles, glowing with purple and green light. Water was recycled from the deep aquifers. It was a miracle of human engineering, but it was a tomb. Eris Thorne was an old man now. His hair was completely white, and he walked with a pronounced limp, the result of a cave-in in the lower mining sectors a decade ago. He sat in his small, sparse office, looking at a physical photograph of his wife and daughter. His wife had died in the first year, succumbing to a respiratory infection that the bunker's limited medical supplies couldn't cure. His daughter, Alara, was alive, but she was a stranger to him, consumed by the work. There was a knock at the door. Enter, Eris said. Alara walked in. She was in her late 30s, her face smudged with grease, her dark hair tied back in a messy knot. She wore the heavy canvas uniform of the engineering corps. The primary mass driver is online, she said, skipping any greeting. We ran the final calibration on the magnetic coils. It held at 99% efficiency. Eris nodded, putting the photograph away. And the targeting array? Linked to the deep space telemetry buoys, Alara replied. She pulled up a chair and sat across from him. Dad, the Kalan monitoring buoy in the Orc cloud is still active. If we power up the main firing sequence, they'll see the energy spike. They'll know we're here. Let them know, Eris said. Alara frowned. We aren't ready. The secondary drivers in the asteroid belt aren't finished. If they send a fleet now, we only have one gun. One gun won't scratch their homeworld shields. We aren't building just one gun, Alara, Eris said softly. He stood up and walked over to the wall map of the Sol system. We are building a system. Look at this. He pointed to the asteroid belt. For 40 years, humanity hadn't just been hiding. They hadn't just been surviving. They had been mining. They had stripped the asteroids of every ounce of iron, nickel, and tungsten. They had hollowed out dwarf planets. The Kalan rely on energy shields, Eris explained, tracing a line from Earth to the belt. Their shields are designed to disperse plasma, to absorb laser fire, to deflect radiation. They are beautiful, elegant shields. But they have a flaw. They aren't designed to stop a mountain moving at a fraction of the speed of light. Ilara looked at the map, her eyes widening as she understood. Relativistic kinetic strikes. Exactly, Eris said. We don't need to build ships. We don't need to cross the galaxy and fight them in their space. We just need to do the math. We turn the entire Sol system into a shotgun. The mass drivers in the belt, the lunar railguns, the deep crust drivers here on Earth. They all fire at the same time, using a chained FTL targeting corridor. It's madness, Ilara whispered. The energy required to accelerate a tungsten rod to 0.4 times the speed of light. It would drain the geothermal taps. We'd be in the dark for months. We've been in the dark for 40 years, Eris said, his voice hard. A few months of cold won't kill us. But if we don't fire, the Kalan will eventually come back to finish the job. Or they'll just ignore us, and we'll die in this hole, knowing they got away with it. Ilara looked at her father. She saw the fire in his eyes, the same fire that had kept him going when the surface burned. She nodded slowly. I'll tell the teams to prep the lunar drivers. We'll need to blind the Kalan buoy first, though. If they see the FTL corridor opening, they'll raise their shields to maximum. Agreed, Eris said. Send a stealth drone to the Orc cloud. Fry the buoy. Then we wake up the system. High Lord Valen of the Kalan Ascendancy was bored. He sat on the observation deck of his flagship, the Radiant Dawn, sipping a glass of nectar wine. The ship was a marvel of Kalan artistry, all sweeping curves and glowing blue energy conduits. Outside the massive viewport, the stars stretched out in a comforting, infinite blanket. Valen was a creature of refined tastes. He viewed warfare not as a brutal necessity, but as an elegant dance. The Kalan had conquered 100 worlds because they were simply better at the dance. Their ships were faster, their weapons were cleaner, and their shields were impenetrable. My lord, a subcommander said, approaching with a respectful bow. We have received a telemetry update from the Sol System Monitor. Valen sighed, swirling his wine. The dirtball? I thought we sterilized that place 40 cycles ago. What is it? The monitor has gone dark, my lord. No signal. Valen frowned. A malfunction? The automated buoys are built to last a millennium. It appears to be a localized energy spike, my lord. Very brief. The buoy was vaporized. Valen set his glass down. The elegant dance of his thoughts was interrupted by a jarring note. Vaporized? By what? The indigenous species was eradicated. We boiled their oceans. Unknown, my lord, but the energy signature matches a localized FTL burst. Someone or something just jumped into the Sol system. Valen stood up, his boredom vanishing, replaced by a cold, sharp irritation. The humans were supposed to be dead. He had watched their cities melt. He had watched their oceans boil into steam. It was an insult to his pride that something in that system was still moving. Plot a course for Sol, Valen ordered. Take the Radiant Dawn and the Third Fleet. If there are survivors crawling out of the ashes, I want them burned again. And this time, I want the crust cracked all the way to the core. Yes, my lord, the subcommander said, bowing and hurrying away. Valen looked back out the viewport. He felt a flicker of annoyance. It was tedious, having to clean up a mess twice. But the Kalan were thorough. They would wipe the system clean, and then they would return to their elegant empire. He had no idea that the mess he was going to clean up had spent the last 40 years building a hammer. The Kalan Third Fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Sol system, just past the orbit of Neptune. On the bridge of the Radiant Dawn, Valen watched the tactical displays light up. The fleet consisted of 50 silver teardrop ships, their energy shields glowing with a soft, protective blue light. They were a beautiful sight, a testament to Kalen's superiority. Scanning the system, the tactical officer announced, "No ships in orbit around Earth. No energy signatures on the surface." "Wait." The officer paused, his fingers flying across the holographic console. "What is it?" Valen asked. "I am detecting massive energy spikes. Not on the planet, in the asteroid belt, and on the moon. My lord, the entire system is lighting up." Valen stepped closer to the display. The asteroid belt, usually a scattered field of dead rocks, was glowing with intense thermal signatures. The moon, which they had cracked during the initial bombardment, was pulsing with power. "Are they building ships?" Valen asked, a hint of confusion in his voice. "No, my lord. The energy signatures are linear. They are mass drivers, huge ones, and they are charging." Valen's blood ran cold. He knew what mass drivers were. They were primitive, crude weapons used by lesser species to move cargo. But the energy readings he was seeing were impossible. "Raise shields to maximum," Valen shouted, his voice cracking slightly. "Evasive maneuvers. Jump us out of here." "Jump drives are spooling, my lord, but the magnetic interference from the asteroid belt is disrupting the FTL corridor. We need 3 minutes to clear the interference." "We don't have 3 minutes," Valen whispered. Deep inside the Earth, in the central command bunker, Eris Thorn watched the main screen. The Kalen fleet was there, hanging in the dark like a swarm of silver insects. Eris felt a profound sense of calm. The waiting was over. The 40 years of darkness, the cold, the loss, the endless digging, it all narrowed down to this single moment. "Targeting solution locked," Ilara said. Her voice was tight, but her hands were steady on the console. "The FTL corridor is aligned directly with the Kalen homeworld, Kalen Prime. The fleet is in the way, but the kinetic energy will punch through them and carry the residual force through the corridor." "Fire," Eris said. He didn't yell it. He didn't slam his fist on the table. He just said it quietly, like a man closing a door. Ilara pressed the execution key. Across the Sol system, the trap sprang. In the asteroid belt, thousands of hollowed-out rocks and dwarf planets vented their atmospheres as massive magnetic coils fired. They didn't fire ships. They fired solid slugs of tungsten and osmium, each the size of a skyscraper. On the moon, the cracked surface erupted as lunar railguns launched hundreds of smaller, but equally dense, projectiles. Deep within the Earth, the geothermal taps drained completely as the planetary mass drivers fired their payloads up through the crust, adding to the swarm. It was not a battle. It was an execution. The projectiles accelerated to 0.4 times the speed of light. At that speed, physics became a weapon of absolute destruction. The slugs didn't just hit the Kalen fleet. They obliterated the space they occupied. On the bridge of the Radiant Dawn, Valen watched the tactical display turn entirely red. The sensors couldn't even track the individual projectiles. They just registered a massive, incoming wave of kinetic energy. "Shields holding at maximum," the tactical officer screamed over the sudden, deafening roar of the ship's alarms. The first tungsten slug hit the shield of a Kalen cruiser. The shield, designed to disperse the heat of a plasma lance, tried to absorb the kinetic impact. It failed instantly. The shield shattered like glass. The slug passed through the cruiser, transferring all its kinetic energy into the ship's hull. The cruiser didn't just explode, it vaporized. The metal of the ship turned into a superheated plasma cloud in a microsecond. Then the rest of the swarm hit. It was a rain of relativistic death. The Kalen ships, beautiful and elegant, were torn apart in seconds. The kinetic impacts created shockwaves in the vacuum of space, tearing the remaining ships to shreds. The Radiant Dawn took 3 hits. The first shattered its shields. The second tore through the hull, venting the bridge into space. The third hit the main reactor, detonating the ship in a blinding flash of white light. The Kalen Third Fleet was gone in less than 4 seconds. But the attack didn't stop. The mass drivers kept firing, pouring millions of tons of metal into the FTL corridor. The kinetic energy rode the FTL wave, traveling across the galaxy at millions of times the speed of light, carrying the unstoppable momentum of the Sol System's wrath. Kalen Prime was a paradise. It was a world of towering crystal cities, lush purple forests, and shimmering oceans. It was the crown jewel of the Kalen Ascendancy, protected by a planetary shield that was considered the absolute pinnacle of their technology. The shield was a shimmering dome of blue energy, visible from orbit, a symbol of their invulnerability. High Counselor Vane was walking through the grand plaza of the capital city, admiring the architecture. The sun was shining, and the air was sweet. It was a perfect day. Then, the sky tore open. There was no warning. No sensors detected the incoming threat because the FTL corridor masked the approach until the very last microsecond. The kinetic payload arrived not as a single wave, but as a continuous, screaming torrent of relativistic metal. The planetary shield flared to life, glowing a brilliant, blinding blue as it tried to absorb the impact. For a fraction of a second, it held. The energy of the shield pushed back against the kinetic force of the tungsten slugs. Then, the math caught up with the magic. The sheer kinetic energy of millions of tons of metal moving at a fraction of light speed exceeded the structural limits of the shield. The blue dome flickered, turned a sickly yellow, and then shattered. The slugs hit the planet. The first impact struck the northern continent. The tungsten rod, moving at 120,000 kilometers per second, hit the crust and transferred its energy into the ground. The resulting explosion was equivalent to a 10-teraton nuclear bomb. The crust didn't just crack, it liquefied. A shockwave of molten rock and superheated air swept across the continent at Mach 50, vaporizing the crystal cities and the purple forests in an instant. The second impact hit the Eastern Ocean. The water flashed into steam, creating a tsunami of superheated vapor that wrapped around the globe, boiling the remaining oceans and stripping the atmosphere away. The third, fourth, and fifth impacts struck the tectonic fault lines. The planet's mantle was fractured. Magma erupted from the core, blowing the planet's crust into space like the shell of a cracked egg. Kalen Prime did not just burn. It was unmade. The beautiful, elegant world was reduced to a swirling cloud of superheated dust and molten rock in a matter of minutes. The Kalen Ascendancy, the proudest empire in the galaxy, was decapitated in a single afternoon. The silence in the bunker was absolute. The geothermal taps were completely drained. The lights flickered and died, replaced by the dim, red glow of the emergency backups. The air was already growing cold. Eris Thorne sat in the dark, staring at the blank main screen. The telemetry was gone. The Kalen fleet was destroyed. The Kalen homeworld was gone. Ilara walked over to him, holding a small chemical lantern. She set it on the table, casting long, dancing shadows across the room. "It's done," she said softly. "It's done," Eris agreed. His voice was raspy. He felt incredibly tired. The adrenaline that had sustained him for 40 years was gone, leaving behind a profound, aching exhaustion. "What now?" Ilara asked. She looked around the dim room, at the exhausted staff who were slowly emerging from their consoles. "We used all our power. The life support will only last a few weeks, on backup. We won the war, Dad. But I think we lost the future." Eris shook his head slowly. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, encrypted data drive. He handed it to Ilara. "Plug that into the comms array," he said. "Use the emergency chemical battery to power the transmitter. Send it on a tight beam to the remaining Kalen colony worlds. We tracked their network during the bombardment. We know where their survivors are." Ilara took the drive, her eyes narrowing in confusion. "What is it?" "The terms of their surrender," Eris said. He stood up, his joints popping in the cold air. "We didn't just kill their fleet, Ilara. We killed their homeworld. We broke their empire. The surviving colonies will be in shock. They will be leaderless, terrified, and waiting for us to come and finish them. We aren't going to." Ilara plugged the drive into the console. The screen flickered to life, showing a simple text document. She read it, her eyes widening as she understood. "You're going to make them work," she said, a small, grim smile touching her lips. "They broke the earth," Eris said, looking up at the ceiling, as if he could see through the 300 feet of rock to the glass surface above. "They turned our home into a sheet of black obsidian. They owe us a new world." The Kalan surrender was not a grand ceremony. There were no parades, no speeches, no exchange of ornate swords. 3 months after the destruction of Kalan Prime, a single, heavily armed human dropship landed on the ash-covered plains of the Kalan colony world, New Kalan. The ship was ugly, blocky, and scarred from micrometeorites. It was a stark contrast to the elegant silver teardrops the Kalan were used to. Eris Thorn, wearing a heavy environmental suit, walked down the ramp. Ilara walked beside him, carrying a simple datapad. Waiting for them on the landing pad was the surviving Kalan leadership, a group of trembling, pale aliens who looked nothing like the proud, arrogant beings who had burned Earth. They wore simple gray robes, stripped of their former glory. The lead Kalan, a former planetary governor named Vale, stepped forward. He bowed low, his head touching the ash. "We surrender," Vale said, his voice shaking. "We offer our complete subjugation. Please spare our people. We will give you our ships, our technology, our resources. Just spare us." Eris looked at the alien. He felt no triumph, no joy. He just felt cold, hard resolve. "We don't want your ships," Eris said, his voice amplified by the suit speakers. "We don't want your technology. We have better." Vale looked up confused. "Then what do you want? What is your price for our lives?" Ilara stepped forward and handed Vale the datapad. "Read the terms." Vale took the pad with trembling hands. He read the screen. His eyes widened, and he let out a soft, horrified gasp. This is impossible," Vale whispered. "The labor requirements, the physical toll, it will take generations. We are not built for this. We are scholars, artists, leaders. We cannot do this." "You burned our world," Eris said, his voice flat and devoid of pity. "You turned our soil to glass. You killed 3 billion people. You owe us a planet." Eris pointed a thick, gloved finger at the datapad. "The terms are simple. You will send 50 million of your strongest workers to the Sol system. They will be equipped with basic tools. They will go to Earth. They will break up the obsidian crust. They will sift the glass. They will mix it with the deep crust soil we have prepared. They will plant the seeds we give them. They will rebuild the biosphere by hand, one handful of dirt at a time." Vale stared at Eris, horror dawning in his eyes. 50 million? For how long?" "Until the Earth is green again," Eris said. "Until the oceans are full. Until the air is clean. It will take 1,000 years. Maybe 10,000. Your children will do it. And their children. And their children's children. You will pay for your hubris, Vale. Not with your lives, but with your sweat." Vale dropped the datapad. He fell to his knees, weeping softly. The other Kalan leaders joined him, bowing their heads in defeat. They realized with a crushing, absolute certainty that the humans had not just defeated them. They had trapped them in a prison of their own making. The Kalan would spend the rest of their existence paying for a crime they could never fully atone for. Eris turned his back on the weeping aliens. He looked up at the sky. It was a pale, sickly yellow, but it was a sky. "Come on, Ilara," Eris said, turning back toward the dropship. "We have a lot of work to do." 50 years later, the sun was rising over the ruins of what used to be New York City. The light caught the edges of the black, glassy crust that still covered most of the continent. It was a harsh, unforgiving landscape, sharp and jagged. But there were breaks in the glass. In a massive, excavated crater, a line of Kalan workers moved slowly. They were dressed in heavy, dust-covered canvas suits. Their hands, once soft and used to holding delicate tools and fine wine, were calloused, scarred, and stained with gray dirt. They held heavy iron pickaxes and shovels. A young Kalan swung his pickaxe, the metal biting into the black glass with a sharp clink. He struck it again and again until a chunk of obsidian broke loose. He dropped the pickaxe, fell to his knees, and used his bare, gloved hands to scoop the broken glass into a metal bucket. An older human overseer, A woman with gray hair and a kind but firm face walked by. She carried a small watering can. She stopped next to the young Kalen, looked at the bucket of broken glass, and nodded. "Good break," she said in plain, clear Kalen. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, green shoot. She placed it gently into the soil beneath the glass. "Water it. Keep it alive." The young Kalen looked at the tiny green plant. It was fragile, weak, and entirely out of place in the harsh, black landscape. But it was alive. He picked up the watering can, his hands trembling slightly, and poured a few drops of water onto the soil. He looked up at the human overseer, then back down at the plant. He picked up his pickaxe and swung it again. Clink, clink, clink. High above, in orbit, a human station watched over the planet. The Earth was still mostly black and gray. The oceans were still toxic sludge. The air was still thin and bitter. It would take centuries to heal. But the glass was breaking. The soil was turning. And the Kalen were digging. Humanity had not just survived the end of the world. They had forced the architects of their destruction to build it back, stone by stone, handful by handful. The counterattack was over. The penance had begun. And for the first time in a long time, the Earth was healing.